Welcome to the Based Boomer Podcast on Eschatology Matters, part of the Fight Left Feast Network. The rise and fall of dispensational premillennialism in American Christianity. When I embraced postmillennialism in August of 2022, I knew next to nothing about where the most popular evangelical eschatology, dispensational premillennialism, came from or how it developed. The reason this is important is because eschatology matters, per the name of this channel. What we think about end times will color everything we think about current times. It determines how we interpret the past, present, and future, not just the end of the future, but everything in between now and when the end comes. If we think planet Earth is destined for an apocalyptic dystopia, guess how we'll think of current events? I'll explain why. But I didn't believe eschatology mattered for most of my Christian life. The speculation surrounding eschatology coming from dispensationalists drove me to become an eschatological agnostic, or as it's often called, a pan-millennialist, as in, it will all pan out in the end. I've heard it called newspaper eschatology because it takes headlines and develops predictions from current events that supposedly tell us about when the Antichrist will appear and the rapture will happen. These predictions have been going on since the mid-19th century, and even though they never turn out to be accurate, that doesn't seem to diminish dispensationalism's popularity, at least as it is assumed by probably 90% of evangelicals to be the truth about the end times. When I became a born-again Christian in 1978, eschatology was a topic of conversation everywhere. The New York Times even declared Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, published in 1970, as the best-selling non-fiction book of the 1970s. I've been learning the fascinating history of how evangelicalism got to this point in a book I first heard about in this interview of the author Daniel Hummel by Al Mohler. We'll have the link in the show notes below per usual. The book, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation. And it has been a revelation for me. Most surprising has been learning that the development of this thinking in the 19th century was a direct response and repudiation of the dominant postmillennialism of the time. I'll explain why, but I've been under the impression that it was the horrific disasters of the 20th century that discredited the post-mill position. But that lamentable century was only the final nail in the coffin of its credibility. It was rather the distortion of the concept of progress in the 19th century with the development of knowledge and science. The distortion was a direct result of the secularism growing out of the empiricism and rationalism of the Enlightenment. God was pushed to the periphery of Western culture, and man enthroned as sovereign creator of progress and civilization. As God said to the builders of Babel, they believed nothing they planned to do will be impossible for them. Speaking of Lyman Stewart, the founder of Biola, Bible Institute of Los Angeles, 1908, Hummel writes, "In this view, amillennialism was a battering ram to break up the postmillennial hold on 19th century Protestantism. With the growing popularity of theological modernism, which adjusted Christ's teachings to the intellectual climate of the late 19th century, Stewart had identified his main rival. The reaction against postmillennialism, however, goes back to the mid-19th century and Irishman J.N. Darby. The earliest new premillennialists, as they were called to distinguish them from the old ones, are what we now call dispensationalists. To the new guys on the block, the world and the church were far too corrupt for the kind of progress 19th century postmillennialism promised. However, it was Darby bringing his version of end times to America in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War, that dispensationalism's march to dominance in American evangelical Christianity began. There's nothing like more than 500,000 of your fellow countrymen being slaughtered fighting each other to bring into question the very idea of progress. But it wasn't only the trauma of war. As Hummel points out, the days of postmillennial consensus ended in the 1860s. The Civil War's violence and destruction helped shatter the image of the United States as the vanguard of the coming kingdom. But this was just the initial shock. Higher criticism of the Bible and Darwinian evolution, two academic discourses that permeated seminaries and universities after the war, began to unravel the biblical case for postmillennialism. But as we'll see, the American obsession with progress would not die easily. Progress in the spirit of 19th century America. It's striking to look back on this side of the unimaginable suffering and misery of the 20th century, wars and numbers of dead, to realize just how much progress obsessed post-Civil War America. George Marsden observes that, quote, in the nation born during the Enlightenment, the reverence for science as the way to understand all aspects of reality was nearly unbounded, unquote. This reverence grew out of the heady Enlightenment assumption that science and reason could solve all mankind's problems eventually. The stunning advances in technology seemed to justify the hubris. All these changes were part of the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War, transforming the largely agrarian society of America's founding into a worldwide economic powerhouse. Along with the change came problems: industrialization and growing populations of immigrants flocking to cities along the East Coast created deplorable conditions for a significant number of people. Christians thought Christianity provided an answer in what came to be known as the social gospel. A significant change in American Christianity was on the horizon. Many 19th century reformers, like abolitionists, were Unitarians, having rejected what they considered the illogical concept of the Trinity. Their hearts were in the right place, but their theology wasn't. German biblical criticism and its rejection of the Bible as reliable history and God's authoritative verbal revelation had a profound effect on Christianity in the growing secular age. The also spreading rejection of Orthodox historic Christianity in the mainline denominations, along with the suffering brought on by the Industrial Revolution, produced the response of the social gospel. This struggle for the soul of Christianity, pun intended, playing out in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, came to be called the Fundamentalist Modernist controversies. The new premillennialists, the term dispensationalism didn't get coined until 1927, were part of the broader fundamentalist movement that eventually came to dominate American evangelicalism. On the fundamentalist side were an amalgamation of Christians loosely held together by a handful of orthodox beliefs about the historical veracity of the Christian faith. On the modernist side were liberals who embraced the social gospel and a religion of progress. To say these two were incompatible is like saying water and fire are not compatible. From the late 1870s to World War I, the leadership of mainline Protestant denominations slowly but surely gave up any pretense in believing the Bible was a supernatural document. They accepted Enlightenment assumptions of empiricism and rationalism, including the inevitable conclusion of German biblical critics' attacks on the Bible's veracity. These were the liberals, and conservatives who stood against them came to be called fundamentalists, from a series of 12 short books, The Fundamentals, written from 1910 to 1915. Even though he was a conservative, William Jennings Bryan echoed what almost all Christians believed prior to World War I. Christian civilization is the greatest that the world has ever known because it rests on a conception of life that makes life one unending progress toward higher things, with no limit to human advancement or development. As George Marsden adds, quote, evangelicals generally regarded almost any sort of progress as evidence of the advance of the kingdom. The Great War was used to attack the credibility of postmillennialism, but it was World War II that put the nail in the coffin. The Soviet Union and Mao's communist China didn't help. Dispensationalism's eventual triumph. Regardless of Bryan's conservative Christian convictions, he embraced a concept of postmillennialism that dispensationalists rightly believed came from liberal Christianity and a distortion of the Bible's understanding of progress as the providential working of God in history through his people. A postmillennialism based on Enlightenment assumptions could never last because progress is a Jewish and Christian concept the pagans stole and bastardized. It's almost like thinking a man can become a woman and a woman a man. Not that anyone would ever think such a thing. The two versions of progress are as mutually exclusive as the sexes. But why did dispensational premillennialism triumph and become the dominant eschatology of 20th century evangelicalism? Before the nail was driven into the coffin by the horrors of the 20th century war and death, revivalism and the great evangelist D.L. Moody paved the way, according to Hummel. The two implications of Moody's ministry, the popularization and fusion of new premillennialism with revivalism, could hardly be separated. They worked together to form a potent and wildly successful message. Moody's ministry spearheaded an interdenominational evangelical ethos shot through with the influences of premillennialism. It's hard to imagine in post-Christian America just how popular and influential Moody was. When he embraced dispensationalism, it gained instant credibility, which in due course would influence one of the most consequential Christians of the 20th century, Cyrus Ingersoll Schofield. Schofield developed and published his reference Bible in 1909, which arguably became the most influential book molding 20th century fundamentalism, which in due course became evangelicalism. It sold 1 million copies in less than a decade and became the best-selling book in the history of Oxford University Press. Nothing like Oxford printing a book to give it max credibility. Schofield systematized the dispensational hermeneutic, and with it, as Hummel says, quote, Schofield transformed the new premillennialism, dispensationalism, into a full-blown religious identity for millions of Christians, unquote. The Schofield Reference Bible was ubiquitous among the baby boomer generation of Christians. When I became a Christian in 1978, I remember it being spoken of in glowing terms and highly suggested as a reference source. In fact, in the early decades of its adoption, quote, it became a common marker of right belief in Moody circles, unquote. This triumph was a long time coming for a new movement. It started with the Pietism growing up in 17th century Germany, made its way into a Brethren movement that eventually influenced Wesley, but importantly for the rise of dispensationalism, Darby, then Moody, then Schofield. His notes established the new premillennialism, revivalism, higher life teachers, and what are called exclusive brethren concepts as the default for fundamentalist Christians. This peaked in the 70s with the late great planet Earth mentality, and I was born again embracing every bit of it. For me, it couldn't last, thankfully. Yes, the 90s was the left behind decade, but when Kirk Cameron himself becomes post-mill, you know the jig is up. Dispensationalism's pietistic dualism. Although dispensationalism today has nothing like the credibility and awareness it had in the 20th century, its assumptions dominate evangelical Christianity. It is those assumptions that led to Christianity's cultural irrelevance in America. One of those is a type of Gnostic dualism, a two-story Christianity in Francis Schaeffer's words, which I learned in 1979 or 80 in his book, The God Who Is There. There are various ways to describe this two-story version of the faith, but it breaks life into two competing realities. Picture a house where upstairs is all the important stuff, the things that are truly meaningful, and downstairs is for the servants, the mundane, everyday stuff. Even though it's the same house, it appears like two completely different houses. Say, upstairs is 19th century Victorian, and downstairs 1960s hip modernism. In Schaeffer's words, upstairs, quote, is above the line of despair, unquote. Everyone without access to the stairs is stuck downstairs, trying to find meaning, hope, and purpose. If you do have a past, you can go upstairs when you want to access the things that really matter in life. This is where the Gnosticism comes in. This philosophy of Greek influence is a kind of secret knowledge which exists in the upper story, and it has little to do with what we experience downstairs. In fact, the stuff downstairs is only relevant as it points to and gets you the pass to the stairs. Then you can leave behind the servants, the plebes, the hoi polloi, unless they too are given one of the passes, and they will get the knowledge that's only had in the upper story. I've pushed the metaphor far enough, but you get the idea. Gnosticism, a version of Platonism, was a constant threat in the first centuries of the church. It was the battle against this threat among others, that forced the Church Fathers, in response, to develop the Orthodox Christianity of the Nicene Creed we believe today. After the Reformation, in due course, the assumptions from dualism through Pietism, revivalism, and dispensationalism became the dominant worldview of evangelical Christianity. Spiritual things were the important part of life, and the mundane and material a necessary evil to be escaped through religious exercises like Bible reading, prayer, and church-going. This was my born-again Christianity until I found Schaeffer and began my journey out of an upstairs-downstairs dualism of pietistic Christianity. It took postmillennialism to finally eradicate it completely for me, but one doesn't have to embrace that eschatology to escape from Gnostic, dualistic, pietistic assumptions. It's just harder to do because these influences are ubiquitous in American evangelicalism, like oxygen, invisible, and everywhere. It's fascinating to learn how this understanding of Christianity developed in its 20th century version from what came before. It's impossible to overstate the influence of the development of fundamentalism in the first 30 or so years of the century, and how it's become the default form of Christianity of almost all evangelical Christians today. It informs, whether they know it or not, how they see not only the practice of their faith, but how they perceive the culture, including politics. The problem is that because of this pietistic dualism, secularism completely took over American culture and Western culture in general. I argued in a recent post that pietism and secularism are two sides of the same coin. I'll put a link in the show notes below for that as well. It's ironic because a solid subset of the fundamentalists believe culture and political engagement was a priority, but they eventually lost to the inherent dualism of their theology. In the history of Christianity, this kind of dualism was rare, although monastic life was a version of it. Reality for people in the Christian West was both material and spiritual. God in the spiritual realm of angels and demons was every bit as real to the people of the Middle Ages as the material world they lived and worked in every day. It wasn't until Pietism and the Enlightenment developed simultaneously in the 17th and 18th century that secularism began its long march to dominance in the West. Christians, including me, often rail against secularism, and rightly so. But it was the dualistic, over-spiritualized version of Christianity and Pietism that gave secularism the cultural air to breathe and grow. Even though Christians up to the early years of fundamentalism attempted cultural engagement, they didn't stand a chance against the juggernaut of secularism. To one degree or another, Christians became so heavenly minded they were no earthly good. Add to pietistic dualism an eschatology that sees evil and sin as inevitably growing worse until Jesus comes back to save the day, and you have a recipe for zero cultural influence, which is exactly what happened. Thus, we live in Wokistan. Cultural Marxism made its long march through the institutions with little or no pushback from Christians in the church. And what pushback there has been ineffectual. To bring evangelical Christianity down to earth, both Pietism and Dispensationalism need to be addressed critically for the inherent dualism they brought to the Christian faith. A Christianity with cultural influence also requires an optimistic eschatology of victory, whatever you call it. Going into battle believing we're going to lose is a recipe for getting more of what got us here in the first place. Embracing postmillennialism is what made all the difference for me and many others. It's worth giving it a look if you have yet to consider it. The battle for the soul of Western culture is only just begun. We'll also put in the show notes below 3 books that I found tremendously helpful to teach me about postmillennialism, because mind you, I knew absolutely nothing about it other than my preconceived notions that were inaccurate. So the first book is by the great theologian Loraine Bettner called The Millennialism. Fantastic. And he is a tremendous writer. Second is The Victory in Jesus, The Bright Hope of Postmillennialism by Greg Bahnsen. And if you're familiar with Bahnsen, enough said. And the last one was truly a mind blower, An Eschatology of Victory by J. Marcellus Kick. And he analyzes in depth Matthew 24. And, You may not agree at the end of the day, but boy, it's a lot. I never heard of this stuff. So praise God for it. Thank you.
Seated here at my right hand.